7 men's stories, exciting entertainment.
Into the depths of the Andes, the incredible survival story of Joe Simpson and Simon Yates. Here is his story. In the year 1985, 2 British climbers embarked on an expedition that would become legendary in the annals of mountaineering. Joe Simpson and Simon Yates set out to conquer the previously unclimbed west face of Siula Grande in the Peruvian Andes. What started as a thrilling adventure quickly turned into a nightmare, an epic story of courage, friendship, and the indomitable will to survive. Their journey through the depths of desperation and triumph remains one of the most powerful testimonies to human endurance. The Ascent, Triumph and Initial Challenges. Joe Simpson and Simon Yates were seasoned climbers with several successful expeditions under their belts. However, Siula Grande, a mountain towering over 6,300 meters, was set to be their most significant challenge yet. The west face of the mountain was steep, icy and treacherous, with unpredictable weather patterns that could change in an instant. Equipped with the necessary gear and high spirits, they began their ascent. The plan was straightforward. They would climb the route together and then descend via the safer North Ridge. On the first day of their climb, everything went according to plan. They made good progress, moving past the base camp and scaling significant heights. The snow crunched beneath their crampons and the sharp edges of Siula Grande gleamed under the sunlight. By the second day, however, the weather began to turn. A snowstorm descended upon the mountains, reducing visibility and piling up snow on the already challenging terrain. Still, Simpson and Yates pressed on, determined not to let the weather defeat them. The summit, a brief moment of victory. After 3 grueling days of climbing and pushing their bodies to the limit, the 2 men finally reached the summit of Siula Grande. They were the first climbers to scale the west face, and the feeling of victory was overwhelming. Standing atop the peak, they gazed out over the endless expanse of the Andes, the mountains and valleys glittering in the sunlight. The wind howled, and the air was thin, reminding them they could not stay long. Simon and Joe quickly began their descent via the North Ridge. There was no time for celebration or extended rest. The descent was tricky and dangerous, and they were exhausted. Yet the true ordeal was only just beginning. The fall, a moment that changed everything. During their descent at an altitude close to 6,000 meters, disaster struck. Joe Simpson lost his footing and fell. It was a brutal fall, and he landed awkwardly on his right leg. A searing pain shot through his body as his tibia snapped and protruded through his skin. Joe screamed in agony, and Simon, only a few meters away, rushed to his side. It was evident that Joe could no longer walk. The leg was not just broken, it was shattered. They found themselves in a dire situation. At that altitude and in such isolation, there was no way to call for help. They were entirely on their own. The brave plan, a descent into darkness. Simon knew they had to act fast. He decided to lower Joe down the mountain. Securing Joe with a rope, he would lower him section by section, a method fraught with risk, but their only viable option. Hour after hour, Simon painstakingly lowered his friend, battling the wind, exhaustion, and plunging temperatures. Darkness fell and the temperatures dropped further. Then the unthinkable happened. As Simon was lowering Joe, Joe slipped over an unseen ice cliff and was suddenly suspended in mid-air. Simon could not see what had happened, and Joe hung precariously over a deep crevasse. Both men were now in an impossible situation, Joe dangling in the void, and Simon unable to either lower him further or pull him back up. The decision: cutting the rope. Minutes turned into an agonizing eternity as Simon struggled to maintain his grip on the rope. The strain on his position grew, and he was on the brink of being pulled over the edge himself. In a moment of desperate resolve, Simon made a decision that would haunt him forever. Believing Joe was already dead, and that his own survival depended on it, Simon cut the rope. With a final, heart-wrenching snap, Joe plunged into the depths. Joe fell into a deep crevasse, buried within the mountain's icy heart. Darkness enveloped him. Simon, thinking his friend had perished, continued his descent alone, tormented by the belief that he had lost Joe forever. The will to live. In the heart of the glacier. But Joe was not dead. Severely injured, alone, and barely able to move, Joe lay at the bottom of the crevasse. Pain racked his body, and the cold seeped into his bones. He knew rescue was impossible. No one would know he was still alive. Yet Joe Simpson refused to give up. With a relentless will to survive, he began to claw his way out of the crevasse. It was a harrowing effort, inching through narrow, icy passageways, each movement sending shockwaves of pain through his shattered leg. Hours passed, and finally he saw a faint glimmer of light. He had reached the top of the crevasse. The agonizing descent, crawling back to base. Camp Joe's ordeal was far from over. The journey back to base camp was long, and every meter was a battle against exhaustion and agony. Day and night he crawled, often moving just a few inches at a time. He found a small ice cave and took refuge there at night, struggling to stay warm and manage the pain. His mind began to blur, the line between reality and hallucination becoming increasingly indistinct. He sipped melted snow for hydration, fighting to stay conscious. It took 3 days for Joe to finally reach the base camp. He was near death, his body ravaged by cold, dehydration, and injury. Simon, who had believed his friend to be lost, was at the base camp, preparing to leave the area. The joy and disbelief at seeing Joe alive were indescribable. The rescue, a reunion at base camp. Simon and another climber, Richard Hawking, who had been waiting at the base camp, immediately set to work taking care of Joe. They gave him water and food, tending to his wounds as best they could. Joe was wrapped in a sleeping bag and carried down the mountain on a makeshift stretcher. It took them several more days to reach a nearby village from where they could summon medical help. Joe was rushed to a hospital and survived his injuries. Multiple surgeries were needed, but he pulled through. Aftermath and legacy, a story of courage and friendship. The story of Joe Simpson and Simon Yates spread worldwide. Joe wrote a book about his experience, Touching the Void, which became a bestseller and was later adapted into a film. Their story is not just one of physical endurance, but also of psychological resilience and the deep bond of friendship between two men. Simon's decision to cut the rope was criticized by some, but Joe always defended him, understanding that Simon had no other choice. This tale is a testament to the human spirit's ability to push beyond its limits to survive, and the incredible strength of the will to live, even in the darkest of moments. It serves as a powerful reminder to us all that hope can be found even in the deepest despair.
Feel free to follow this channel to avoid missing any new content. Disclaimer: the images are AI generated and are for illustration purposes. The stories on this channel are researched to the best of our knowledge.